So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would first like to thank the European Covered Bond Council and the Spanish Mortgage Association for extending this invitation to Banco de España. It's an impressive, I have to say, an impressive organization, and I would like to praise all those responsible for this outstanding event. I'm honored to speak in front of this distinguished audience, and especially delighted because I don't need to speak about risks, leverage, turmoil, potential financial crisis. One has to trace back to 1899, I think, to spot the latest default of a covered bond issue. So it would seem we're talking about a success story and a contributor to financial stability and economic development. So my conclusion is I have an easy task in front of me today. And where better than in this magnificent city? Luca was talking about Coldplay and the Rolling Stones, but I think the real star of the show is Seville, I have to say. So let us journey back briefly to the Spanish Golden Age. They say the sun never set on the empire. And Seville stood proudly as its financial epicenter. In the 16th and 17th century, this city was more than a gateway to the New World. It served as the empire's central hub for trade, capital, and innovation. With the founding, in particular, of the Casa de Contratación, the trading house, in 1503, Seville became the sole port authorized for trade with the Americas. This monopoly of transatlantic commerce attracted merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs from all around Europe, transforming the city into a magnet for capital flows, underwriting imperial expansion, and global trade. But Seville's financial brilliance wasn't just in its cargo. It thrived on innovation, mastering the art of finance. The city pulsed with the predecessors of modern bonds. Instruments like bills of exchange enabled cross-border transactions. The censos secured loans with land, effectively functioning as early mortgage contracts. And the juros, royal annuities traded like currency, funded wars and conquests, but also the great infrastructure projects, palaces and cathedrals, giving rise to a cultural legacy that still echoes today. So as one observer wrote, Seville was not a city, it was the world's perch. And of course, the related opportunity and scale attracted the international banking houses from Genoa, Flanders, and Germany, much like covered bonds are bringing all of you here today. So now let's fast forward a few centuries to the global financial crisis of 2007, 2009, and its immediate European shockwave in the form of sovereign debt crisis that spanned a few more years. Funding conditions had been significantly affected due to concerns over asset quality and the sustainability of some banks' business models, together with strong links between banks and their sovereigns. So in order to reverse the situation, and at the same time reducing reliance on public sector backstops, it was necessary to restore the resilience of credit institutions and market confidence in the banking system. Covered bonds offered the required solution as a simple and transparent alternative which avoided recourse to exotic, uninsured, deposit-like instruments. The sheer structuring of covered bonds prevented the type of incentive issues that had featured during the crisis, making them an appealing alternative to restore banks' sound funding structures and, in turn, to revive mortgage lending. In particular, the over-collateralization of bonds principal outstanding, bankruptcy remote asset pools, and of course, holders' dual recourse to both the collateral pool and, upon default, the bank's full balance sheet if the cover pool were not enough to make the bondholders whole. Covered bond markets were already well established in some European countries and represented a relevant source of cost-effective long-term funding for credit institutions. The following years saw them grow to a multi-trillion euro market, partly thanks to the flexibility allowed by UCITS, by Article 54 of UCITS, which allowed funds to invest more heavily in covered bonds by passing the usual 5-10-40 diversification rule. This was obviously a first form of high-level harmonization, but it was not considered enough. Among other reasons, the CRR had set out criteria for banks' holdings of covered bonds to be assigned a preferential treatment in terms of regulatory capital requirements. But such preferential treatment was granted to dissimilar instruments at that time in terms of their features and risks. So the introduction of the covered bond legislative package in 2019, the directive and the regulation, provided a common basis for issuers and investors, giving these instruments visibility and recognition with the label, with the European covered bond label that Stefano was referring to, ensuring their consistent treatment, and clearly defining dual recourse as the basic structural feature that differentiates covered bonds from other similar instruments. The 2019 covered bond framework also set out the eligibility, coverage, and liquidity requirements of the covered pool, as well as transparency and supervision requirements, to which I will refer in a moment. So all this made covered bonds an even more attractive investment alternative. So what happened in Spain? Here, the covered bond directive was transposed through Royal Decree Law 24/2021, which then saw some amendments in the following years, and harmonization had a direct impact on the pre-existing legal framework for covered bonds. For example, the old Spanish covered bonds were backed by the entire portfolio of eligible assets, so meaning the entire mortgage portfolio. And in that sense, the new regime had the effect of reducing asset encumbrance. Also thanks to the less rigid over-collateralization requirements of 5%, significantly below the 25% that was required for mortgage-covered bonds before, or the 43% for public sector covered bonds and the cédulas de internacionalización, which were a type of covered bond backed by loans to Spanish companies for their international activities. It must be noted that while some issuers have retained over-collateralization levels close to those previously required, others have removed assets from the covered pool without any noticeable rating impairment in their issuances. There are other specificities of the Spanish post-harmonization covered bond market and the post-harmonization regulatory regime that are worth mentioning. Most of them reinforcing covered bonds' attractiveness to investors. For instance, when loans sour, most issuers exclude non-performing loans from the covered pools. Issuers that do retain NPLs have different criteria regarding when to remove those assets from the pools. The new regulation makes use of derivatives more feasible, as derivative counterparties now rank equally, pari passu, with covered bond holders. In this context, I have to say effective use of derivatives varies among Spanish banks depending on the features of their asset and liability management and the specific techniques to deal with interest rate mismatches. But the new regulation is there and it makes use of derivatives more feasible. Also with that investor protection goal in mind, the liquidity buffer for soft bullet covered bonds must be calculated considering the original maturity and not the potentially extended maturity. And the trigger event for extension is scrutinized by Banco de España in the context of its supervisory powers regarding covered bond issuances. And I would like to emphasize the relevance of this last feature on the liquidity buffer for soft bullet covered bonds. Not only for its relevance, not only for investor protection, but also in terms of financial stability, which, as you know, obviously is something that we regulators are very concerned about. The ability to automatically extend the bond's scheduled maturity without triggering default gives issuers time to liquidate covered pool assets in an orderly way, reducing fire sale risk. And at the same time, a more stringent liquidity buffer achieves more predictable cash flow streams while also retaining the flexibility sought with this tool. Last but not least, in terms of the features of the Spanish regime, governance is enhanced with the need to register and monitor covered pool assets, as well as the dedicated insolvency administrator. The covered pool register must include all covered pool loans, as well as assets held to manage liquidity and derivatives, contracts, and collateral. It must ensure that all covered pool assets can be individually identified at any time, and all assets included in the register are presumed to be covered by the preferential rights of covered bondholders. In turn, the insolvency administrator would be appointed following issuer default, implying the legal transfer of the covered bond program to a separate state. This administrator would have broad powers to manage and sell the covered pool assets, with a duty to preserve the rights and interests of covered bondholders. So before turning to Banco de España's supervisory function, let me briefly touch on an important aspect that contributed to the Spanish success in transitioning to this new regime. When the Royal Decree Law came into force, its provisions became fully applicable to covered bonds issued before that date, effectively dismissing any grandfathering-like solution, and therefore going beyond the directive's provisions. This was called the Big Bang solution, and it was chosen on the basis that maintaining two types of segments within the covered bond market was considered fragmentary and difficult to manage. The Royal Decree Law specifically banned any right of the affected bondholders to claim for early repayments of the bonds. And on July 4th, 2022, once the issuers had already implemented all the requirements in the Royal Decree Law, Banco de España approved the programs of all outstanding issues, classifying them as premium. And transitional measures mainly contemplated the setting up of the initial pools of assets, the appointment of the external cover pool monitor, I will refer to this in a moment, and the approval process by Banco de España. So let me now turn to our supervisory function, Banco de España's supervisory function, which, like the features and measures I have just referred, is designed with the main purpose of protecting investors. Banco de España is empowered to conduct any supervisory and sanctioning activities as necessary to perform the task of covered bond public supervision envisaged in the European covered bond package. Supervisory work feeds on the quarterly confidential returns issuers are required to submit to Banco de España, and a dedicated supervisory team deals with covered bonds with the support from the regulation department, from us. As a complement to the supervisory regime, the Spanish issuing institutions designate a cover pool monitor, a sort of control body, which must be authorized by Banco de España and is entrusted with the ongoing monitoring of the cover assets. So far, this supervisory framework has had a sound, compounding effect in terms of the scrutiny of issuances. Individual monitoring on each of the issuing institutions by the designated control body, by that cover pool monitor, is complemented by individual inspections and consolidated horizontal analysis and deep dives. As a useful new development, the 2024 action plan by Director General Supervision in Banco de España has started to include priorities and inspection plans targeting specifically covered bonds. Two of the issuers were inspected in 2024, with action resuming in 2025. And of course, this information is posted on the Banco de España website. You also have numbers and figures in the slides that are going to be circulated by the CBC. You have information also in the website, like I said, together with the list of authorized issuing institutions and covered bonds issued under authorized programs. I also have to say that besides Banco de España, the CNMV, which is the Spanish Securities and Markets Authority, also has a role in the public supervision of the covered bond market, specifically supervising compliance with the marketing requirements for covered bonds, their offering to the public, and aspects related to the secondary covered bond market. So, like I said at the beginning of my intervention, this is an easy and nice story to tell. Thanks to the efforts of the issuing banks and the dedicated teams at Banco de España, today we're talking about a success story and a clear example of well-managed public-private partnership. Issuing institutions have made efforts to adapt to the requirements of the covered bond regime, and the market is functioning smoothly, providing greater security to covered bonds investors. The whole transition process has been closely monitored by Banco de España, and we are now entering a phase of enhanced supervision and transparency. So just as the trading house and the ancient versions of modern-day bonds contributed to making Seville the beating heart of imperial and global finance, Today's banks and investors are lucky to be able to navigate their respective funding and cash management needs with the help of liquid, transparent, standardized instruments such as covered bonds, availing of a sound and predictable regulatory framework, and reminding us that, much like in 16th century Seville, sound and sustainable innovation has always been the currency of progress. Thank you very much.